Quinta de Bomfim is one of the port houses that can be easily accessed by walking just from the downtown center of Pinhao itself.
Quinta de Bomfim being the main house for Dows Port. We also own Warre, Grams and Cockburns, other port brands and some of the most recognized port brands around the world. I like to start the visit from here, mostly because of the view that you got in there. Over there you have a nice example of the Douro Valley, how it is. This is the main characteristic of this area, the stone terraces up on the hills. This was the way that we found to take some better profit from the land. It's so steep that if we do not do it like this, it will be hard to put our vines growing in here. It's a steep inclination on the field. And this is what characterizes the Douro Valley, and it's mostly because of these views that we are part of the World Heritage of UNESCO since 2001. But on the other hand, this beautiful landscape, for example, it's the second largest landscape in the whole world transformed by the human being with their own hands. But the problem is, even nowadays, the most it's still done by hand. 90% of the work, and it's getting hard to find all those workers from here to here, so we were obliged to introduce machinery, but there we cannot use as many machines as we would like to because it's hard. The geography, the morphology, it's everything against us. But on the other hand, we do produce a lot of high quality wines, which is of course the most important thing here. The Douro Valley as a wine region, it's at the same time the oldest demarcated and regulated wine region in the whole world, 18th century, 1756, a huge area, more than 600,000 acres of total extension, but around 111 actually nowadays growing grapes. This place, Quinta de Bomfim, belongs to the Symington family, and the Symington family actually nowadays it's the last port house that it's 100% family business for a long time already, more than 140 years of history and still being done more history, 5 generations, and a Portuguese family business. They have Scottish roots, okay, and we never forgot our roots, of course, but since the 3rd generation, almost all of them born in Portugal, and they remain here for a long time, so of course it's a Portuguese family business. Quinta de Bomfim, it's a property with around 200 acres in total, but in the 27 estates, we have more or less 2,500 acres of total area with planted vines nowadays to grow our grapes. It's not enough to our wine production. We do buy grapes from smaller producers, and the Douro Valley nowadays has more than 35,000 authorized producers of grapes or wine, which is not so hard to find the grapes. Some of those producers, we keep them as partners of business for a long time already. We know that we have high quality. The thing is that in order to prevail the profiles of each brand, we try to get the grapes from the small suppliers from the surrounding area of each main estate for each brand in order to keep the same profile of grapes to produce the same profile of wine. Here we also have another great example of the stone terraces. Although the vines here are not so old, the average age is around 45 years old, there are 2 small plots or parcels inside of the property with 60 years old. Those ones with a smaller yield of production, of course, but higher quality on the grapes. So normally the whole vines are the ones that we keep for high quality wines or even to do blends. In a straight line, the whole extension from the very beginning till the end, you find 50 miles, not a huge distance. We are not far away from the ocean. We are about 85 miles from the Atlantic Ocean in Porto. The main reason to have here a hot and dry weather and not Atlantic weather, it's located at the very beginning. The 3 big mountains that you find in here. Alvão, Marão, Monte Muro. High mountains working as a natural barrier, protecting the valley into exposure into any kind of ocean breeze or winds that allows us to have a hot and dry weather here. You may start, imagine, early morning in Porto with a rainy day, with some fog, with temperatures about 50, 55 Fahrenheit. You came up, you cross the mountains, and at least you will find around 65, 70, and no rain at all, or not even fog. The main reason are the 3 big mountains. And of course, all further up you go more into the interior land, yes, it gets hotter and drier. That's why Douro Superior, for example, it's the most extreme area. The hottest during summer, the coldest during winter, a huge variation in terms of temperature, low and high temperatures, and the one with less rain. 250 millimeters per square meter, it's in general the average of rain over there, which is almost nothing. So this allows to create, for example, here, mostly in some of the grapes, really small berries, yes, not really juicier ones, but quite concentrated, which then gives you lots of structure into your wines. And that location allows also, on a simple way, to say that over here some of the lightest wines could be produced. And mostly here, this is the area most well known for port production. In here we do produce a lot of ports, but a lot of also red wine, full body reds, quite complex reds with a huge capacity to keep aging along of the years inside of the bottle, okay? Each property then has a different micro terroir, which is the richness of the valley. With the same grape, Touriga Nacional, in a different location, you will produce a different profile. And that's what allows us, for example, talking about ourselves, to have 4 port brands, Grams, Cockburns, Dows, Warres, and all of them, even if you try the same kind of port, 10 years for example, Grams will be fruitier, sweeter, Cockburns more pepperish notes at the very end of the taste, Dows the driest brand, even with sugar it could be drier than any of the others, and Warres, and the main characteristic of Warres port is that we grow grapes in higher altitudes, not at the bottom, so less sugar content, but then more floral notes, more freshness, some more acidity in the wines. This is possible with the brands because of the location of the different estates around the valley, okay? For example, in here you find Quinta da Cavadinha, Quinta de Bomfim, and Quinta dos Malvedos. If we do here a circle, you have something like more or less 15 miles of distance around them, the three. But here you have high altitude, here at the very bottom of the valley, and Malvedos too. Those 3 brands, they produce different profiles. Dry ports, more floral notes, more fruity and more sweet. And what's the big difference? Here it's easy, it's altitude. Here, bottom of the valley, so more heat from the sun, and you can produce more sugary grapes, and of course the wines will be dry, sweeter. But in this case, the big difference between this and this, they are more or less at the same altitude, with the same weather, but here our vines, they are already distant from the river, with 120 meters, more or less, distance from the river. But here, the vines are quite exposed into the river. So the river works like a mirror, reflecting more sun intensity. And that proximity allows more sun intensity into the grapes, so at the end it will have more sugar. That's why the profile is sweeter and a little bit more fruity than this one. It doesn't mean that Dows, it's not sweet at all. It is, but compared to Grams, it's a drier brand that we produce with less residual sugar in generally. And this is a nice thing to understand the terroir. A common terroir, but then each of the 3 estates with a different tiny micro terroir that produces a different profile. There, let's take a look, for example, at the photos here to understand how hard the work was always in here. This is a photo from 1963. But this work, the way how they carry the grapes with these earthen baskets, it was done until the 90s. At the 90s, you still find a lot of small producers picking the grapes and then transporting them with these earthen baskets. And the thing is that yes, the earthen baskets, they are quite beautiful, they are handicraft art, but they may have up to 65 kilos each. So lots of hard work. A property like this at the early beginnings, in an harvest they will have 100 workers. You need a team to carry, you need to cut them. A lot of workers were needed. Nowadays we transport them by truck, which is easier. And another thing to show how hard this was always, carrying wine from here to Vila Nova de Gaia, so down on the river. We are inside of this building, okay? This photo is from 1960, so look at the river in here. Shallow waters. Almost no water, so going down was the easiest part, because up against the stream it was quite hard to then came up to carry more wine down. This image, the main reason to be so shallow waters on those times, no dams. After the 70s, beginning of the 70s, the first one I think started in 74, until the early 90s, we start to construct dams, so the level of the water raised a lot. But during those times, there was just a small channel where the boats can go. That's why Barco Rebelo was such a flat boat, like a kind of a Viking boat, in order to go in shallow waters, okay? Nowadays it's easier by track, okay? 1970, it was when we bought Grams. For example, 45, one of the best vintages of all time. 63, also a great vintage year. That's why we also have here. It's a mix of history, but also important facts from the company or from the production of wine in general. For example, I like this one, 86. It was not a great year, but it's my year of born, so I like it.
The 78 is my year.
78?
Yeah.
I'm from 86. The wine around that year was awful. It's hard to find wines from there, but at least we have good people from 86. So, winery in here, and because it's getting hard to find all the workers that we need in order, for example, to do this, the stomping on the traditional manner, the traditional foot road, and where people go barefoot stomping the grapes to produce our wines, we were obliged to introduce machinery because we could not find all the workers. And if we need lots of manual labor at the vines, it's where we focus that manual labor if we don't have the enough numbers. So nowadays we have 10 different wineries. With 9 of those wineries, the wines are all produced under this system or similar systems. A system that replicates quite well the traditional stomping, the barefoot stomping. For example, here we have 6 different stainless steel tanks that we call lagarde with a total capacity of 12 tons and a half. And here, these machines, they do the same thing. You won't notice a difference between these wines that are produced nowadays under this manner or the traditional one. And in order to do that, before grapes go down, we need to select to have the best ones inside. So when the grapes arrive here during September, during the whole harvest, there's a first stage where we select the grapes with the stem them, and we slightly pre-crush the grapes and send them directly down into the lagarde to have here the very best ones. When the lagarde is ready, the machine there that we see will come at once into each of the lagardes and will do the stomping. In order to do like the traditional manner and replicate that same work, 2 to 3 hours in a row, more or less. The machine has a system with lots of different parameters to replicate that same work. Some of the most important, a pressostat, 80 kilos power pressing, no more than that. In general, it's the average weight of an adult. Then the surface that will do the stomping during all that time, it's a silicon surface, so we can have a tender surface, more or less like our own food, that will do a soft extraction along of the time, but never crushing the seed, which is quite important, or otherwise you will get bitterness into your wine. So the system is quite accurate, does the same as the traditional stomping, and the big difference that happens then to produce a port or a red, it's that red wine or white wine, the alcohol content results from the whole sugar that we have on the grapes being transformed by the yeast into alcohol. So it takes a long time. Sometimes in a red wine, it easily can go up to 14, 15 days. On the other hand, port, it's a fortified wine, like Madeira, sherry, or even muscatel. It means that something will be added into the fermentation in order to interrupt the fermentation, keep sugar, and increase the alcohol amount. And normally, that's why port fermentation maximum will go up to 48 hours, 2 days, okay? Because we need to keep a high volume of sugar. So when we found at that point that we have the right amount of sugar for that specific port, we will interrupt the fermentation. We will add this wine spirit, and the wine spirit is also produced from leftovers of the wine production, okay? By regulation, it should be neutral, with no flavor, no color, no aroma, but with a huge amount of alcohol, 77%, that will immediately neutralize the yeast. The yeast cannot survive into this alcoholic condition, so we keep the sugar, the residual sugar that is still there, and at the same time, the amount of alcohol will increase. That's why port has between 18.5% to 21%. This is a big difference. The grapes are the same, the way how we take care of them until we interrupt the fermentation, it's the same. After that point that we interrupt the fermentation, normally nowadays, everything will be moved from the lagage into this room in here. And then in this stainless steel tanks, we will still let the wine, the skins, all the thing from the fermentation still be in touch, in contact during a few more hours to better extract tannins, colors, flavors, the very good things that we enjoy in the wine. After that point, finally, we will separate the wine from all the solid parts, and easily, after all of those tasks, we have port, a young port that needs to age inside of oak barrels. Inside of this building, you find in first 3 different kinds of barrels to age port. So in here, this is a balseiro. We call this balseiro. Then there in a row till the end of the room, that larger barrels, we call it tunnel. And then here, the small ones, pipa. And here we have 2 different styles of port. Actually, there are 3, but here we only have red port. So at my left side, balseiros or tunéis, they have ruby port inside. In the small barrels, like those ones, pipa, we do have tawnies. And what's the big difference between a ruby and a tawny? Of course, the aging. In here, in the rubies, they spend less time in, first of all, aging. A minimum of 18 months up to a maximum of 6 years, okay? And by aging the wines in a short period of time inside of big, massive ones, you can have less air contact into the wine. Imagine, inside of the whole barrel, just a small part of the whole wine that we kept inside, as always, or has been with oak contact. So it's suffering air contact at the same time, some oxidation in the wine. And the oxidation changes your wine. Your wine will lose color, will lose flavors, and will gain other kind of complexity along of the years. So by minimizing the oxidation, it's a process where we minimize the oxidation in the wines. Rubies, in general, they have a ruby color or a kind of. They are fresh, fruity, and young. Then inside of the rubies, of course, you find different categories in terms of quality, with vintage port being at the very top. Vintage port, it's not produced every year, but just when we do have a high quality year, a special year. Normally, to declare a vintage port, sometimes we need to wait between 2 to 3 years in order to know if this is a great year that will be declared as a vintage. Even inside of the vintage world, you may have a classic vintage year, a vintage year that was mostly exceptional for the most of the producers, so they find a kind of agreement and the port factory may declare a vintage year, a classic one. Or, on the other hand, you may find also single Quinta vintage, which means also a high quality year, but not for everyone, for a few producers, and they may get a declaration through the Institute of Port in order to produce a single Quinta vintage. Vintage, maximum 2 years in oak aging, bottle and non-filtered. So the wine will go aging inside of the bottle along of years, up to centuries sometimes. And because it's an unfiltered wine, the wine has this capacity to age. And normally, yes, of course they will always go into a pike depending in the kind of vintage, but they will be conservated along of years, really centuries. It's not easy, but you can find vintage port from the 18th, 19th century. You still can find some at the market. Of course, they should be quite expensive. Then, after the vintage, you also have another ruby reserve, the late bottle vintage, also a single harvest ruby like a vintage, but not with the same quality as the vintage. High quality still, but not the same amount of quality like in a vintage. And with more time aging here, a minimum of 4 years into a maximum of 6. But generally, then when bottled, they are filtered. So the wine is being stabilized and ready to drink, not aging anymore inside of the bottle. But there are also unfiltered late bottle vintage. Those ones, they still go aging and keep aging inside of the bottle, more or less like a vintage, probably not for such a long time, but they still can get better inside of the bottle. Then, fine ruby, ruby reserve, special reserve rubies. Those ones are all blends of different years that may vary between 3 to 6 years old, ready to drink, not aging anymore inside of the bottle. Important thing to know, we minimize oxidation in the whole aging. So, logically, when you open a bottle, when it's time to drink, you should drink them faster, or the air contact will be damaging the wine, more or less like in a red wine. A vintage, it's really the one for a special occasion. 2-3 days maximum. If you have a Cockburn system or something like that, you can enlarge it up to 5 days, but the wine at the very best, very last drop won't be really the best one to drink. So in my opinion, vintage, we keep it for a special occasion. Best family, best friends, when it's time to open and drink the whole wine. Then, the other rubies, it may vary from 2 to sometimes 8 weeks. After open, it's better a wine cellar or at least the fridge, a constant temperature that allows you to preserve the wine, okay? If you want to drink port every day, and it's not a bad thing to do, tawnies should be your choice, because the aging here is slightly different. A smaller barrel, in first, more oak contact in between the wines, so more oxidation. Minimum aging, 7 years, so a ruby could be transformed into a tawny. But then normally no limit, you may age a tawny for as many years as you decide, as you wish. And of course, how much time we keep the wine aging here? More and more oxidation, so the wine will lose color. So how older the colors tend to be golden, more ambrish tones. And then the complexity of the flavors. Because we use old oak barrels and we let it age for such a long time, there will be a huge transformation in flavors inside of the barrel. In a ruby, you have lots of fresh fruit, jammy flavors, berries, strawberries, that you can get by minimizing the oxidation. You maintain freshness in your wines. On the other hand, here you will go a little bit more into a dry side. you will start to find more nutty notes like almond, hazelnut, chestnut, peanut. But then honey, toffee, vanilla, coffee are quite common flavors in the tawnies because we age them for a longer time, exposing them into a higher oxidation. Inside of the tawnies, of course, there are different categories too. You find also a single harvest tawny, the only one from a single year, that stands normally a long time aging, and when bottled, mentioning year of bottling and year of harvest. So you know the precise age of the wine. All the other tawnies, you don't know it. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, tawnies with indication of age, they are blends, okay? With generally not being an accurate average age, the indication of age, but more a minimal age indication into that blend, the younger wine that you may use to produce the blend. Then you may find also even fine tawny or tawny reserve, younger blends, up to 10 years old maximum the age of the wines. But any of those, when open, they will prevail good to drink during a longer time. Logically, a little bit more of oxidation will be an issue in the wine. So in between 4-5 weeks for a really young tawny, sometimes up to 6-7 months in an old tawny, the wine will be still good to drink. That's why it's a better option to open a bottle and have it home and drink a glass whenever we want.